All right. Welcome, everyone, to WNORTH's Just Published. We are in our July episode, and I'm so thrilled to welcome Elizabeth Cronise McLaughlin to the stage to talk about her new book, Becoming Heroines. So welcome, Elizabeth, to the WNORTH stage once again.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be back. You know, it's funny. I feel almost like parts of this book were birthed on the WNORTH stage in 2016, and I think it was 2017 or 2018 when you had me there talking as a keynote. So it feels like a real full circle to come back and talk to you all now about the book.
Yes, and I was just saying earlier, the timing of this book is really impeccable, and so let's maybe just start off with you sharing a little bit about the book and the journey to writing it, and maybe the top elevator pitch of what you want people to understand about why you wrote this book.
Yeah, so I think as many of the folks who were at WNORTH and are in WNORTH know, my expertise for the last 10 years has really been about women's leadership. And one of the things that kind of became a growing theme through our work here at the Gaia Project for Women's Leadership was this issue of why it was that even when we saw organizations that claimed to be committed to diversity and inclusion and women's advancement, women were still finding it extremely difficult to crack the glass ceiling. And one of the things that has happened over the last few years, and again, was born in some fashion out of some of the talks that I gave for you all, was why that was. And honestly, when we got, through the 2016 election here in the States and really began to have much more public conversations about things like systemic racism and systemic sexism and institutionalized oppression, it became more and more difficult for me and the work that I was doing out there in the world to not look at the challenges that women leaders were facing through not just their individual achievement lenses, but really through the lenses of systemic and institutionalized structures of oppression. And so one of the things that is a really big takeaway from the book is that when we measure our success as women and other diverse talent, frankly, through the lens of metrics that were not designed by us or for us, we will always be behind the eight ball. And one of the reasons for that is that these are systems that were designed to succeed through our failure, to be really candid about it. And so the opening part of the book talks quite a bit about the fact that structures that were designed for the success of white, cisgendered, able-bodied men, other categories of privilege attaching to that as well, need our failure in order to stay the structures that in their existing form. And so the book is really about how do we as women leaders claim our voices and set different metrics of success that are really about how we give our gifts back to the community and how we go about building whole new systems that function for the benefit of all rather than the benefit of a very tiny fraction of society. And so the book is divided up into 4 sections: recognition, reconciliation, revolution, and rebirth. And I'm happy to talk through what those are about if you would care to. But
yes, actually, so just on the note of timing, like I think what COVID really showed us is just how broken our systems were.
Yeah.
I mean, we knew that for such a long time, but when it stripped everything back, we realized that it's never going to change. We've been talking about how there are so few women in the C-suite for 25 years, and nothing's changed. So when I said earlier that the timing of this book, that rebuilding and the tearing down of systemic racism and systems that just don't work for diversity of thought and rebuilding. So share with me the 4 R's. I want to go through that.
Yeah. So recognition is where I think a lot of folks were in the States, at least, and eventually globally around the time of the 2016 election, where that's one example of the recognition stage, which is the point where you realize that things as they are cannot stand any longer. And the real question becomes, what are you going to do about it? And so the whole first section of the book is about not just that moment of recognition and awakening, but also about what we have to do to get to a point where we overcome all that we've been told about our ability to create change. And so that's about internalized racism and sexism. It's about the messages that we give ourselves about our own worthiness. It's about the ways in which we've been silenced and where we think we're allowed to use our voices and where we're not. So the whole first section of the book is really about that internal unpacking. And one of the things that you'll remember from one of the talks I gave way back when, 5 years ago now, is this idea that we work with at the Gaia Project quite a bit, which is that when you change the inner, you change the outer. That necessarily, in order to create mass transformation, we have to be willing to do the internal work at the same time. So it really starts from that place. Reconciliation is where we come to terms with our own trauma, by all of these experiences that we have in our culture, whether that's sexual violence or discrimination or other forms of othering. And also how, and I think this is one of the really key points of the book, we are used by white supremacist patriarchy to further its aims. And this part of the book has very pointed discussions for white women in particular about the ways in which we are often complicit. And some of that is about what we have internalized about, there only being room for so many of us at the top. It's about the ways in which when we don't investigate our own internalized racism, we can become agents of it in our work, consciously and unconsciously. And so a big chunk of that second section of the book is about coming to terms with that. And how do we come to terms with our own experiences and how we've been used and how do we start to repair that? And that section of the book for me is, one of the most significant ones. I think it's a conversation that we need to be having all the time right now. Revolution is the third section of the book. And I always have to say to everybody when I talk about this, that I'm not talking about armed overthrow of the government. What I'm really talking about is the way in which we revolve and evolve away from systems that no longer serve us. And so that means things like standing up for policies and political positions and significant shifts in our culture and in our world and in your workplace, because it's the right thing to do, because we understand that if we don't actually take a stand and understand that, by the way, wherever you have privilege, you have to be willing to undermine it, frankly, to get to equity. If we are not willing to do that, then everything just stays the same. And so there is discussions in the revolution section about, for instance, models of leadership that are not hierarchical, that are not based on patriarchal and traditionally systemically oppressive structures of leadership. There's discussions in there about the fact that we have to take revolution into our own lives and stop putting up with things in our personal lives that we wouldn't want for our friends or our colleagues or our allies.
Would you say that we're maybe in that revolution right now, that stage
I think we
coming out of COVID?
Yeah, I think that coming out of COVID, let's put it this way, I think we're right now in a tremendous cauldron of possibility. And I think that one of the things that has yet to be determined is the extent to which we're all willing to claim that. Because as I talk about in the book, there is this phenomenon called the terror field, where when you start moving toward really significant change, the closer you get to making it, the more fear you experience, and also the more pushback you may get from external forces. And we're seeing some of that here now, for instance, just to take a very of the moment example in the context of voting rights, right? Where we saw this tremendous turnout here in Georgia, right? We saw red states flip completely blue. We saw our Senate here flip to 50-50, which was not predicted when we were heading into the November election. And now on the flip side of that, we're seeing these incredibly retrogressive efforts to keep Black and brown people, to keep working mothers from having access to the ballot box. And so the real question is, how do we keep going? And in the face of pressure, how do we maintain endurance, which is a whole theme throughout the book? And how do we make sure that we maximize that opportunity? I see so much possibility. And also I have moments where I worry about the pushback and how afraid people are. And that's one of the reasons why I am pleased with the timing of the book, because the book is really about now's the moment to claim that opportunity, because it doesn't come along. This is a once in a lifetime possibility, once in a century in terms of a pandemic chance for us to really create radical revolutionary shifts in our society and our culture on every level for the benefit of everyone and not just those of us who had it in advance.
Yeah. And so the final section of the book, Rebirth.
Yes.
What does that look like?
So Rebirth is really about the place where we have to step outside the way we've been told it always has to be and start imagining what futures committed to equity look like. And so that includes things like collaborating across intersectional identities to create change. It includes things like really living into the idea that we can create change in rapid order if we all work together toward it. It doesn't have to be 10 years from now. It doesn't have to be 5 years from now. That, the place we're living in right now presents the chance for immediate change. I was on a call a couple of days ago where someone pointed out this really astute observation, which is that, for instance, I know in Canada, you all have a lot of these sort of like paid leave circumstances for working mothers that are really beautiful and long and extended. I know you've benefited from that yourself. Here we've never had things like that. But what we did see was that all of a sudden, when so many people were out of work, our government was able to find $1,200 for people to have out of nowhere, right? So the idea that we couldn't have universal basic income, which I think we all sort of recognized was a myth if we were paying attention to it, suddenly we saw an immediate shift in that. And now here in California, where I live now, we're seeing on a state level a similar sort of commitment overnight. And so I like to point to the fact that I sit in coalition with my sisters of color on this, who have been talking for so long about the fact that they've been told to wait, right? Like, wait, it's coming, change is happening, you just have to be patient. No, my perspective on this at this point is that change can happen very quickly when we commit to it. And so Rebirth is about, one, that idea. And also, I will just say that I'm very much in a place right now, another concept that I was introduced to just in the last week as the book was coming out, which is discussed in the book, but not in this terminology, is the idea of decolonizing your own imagination, right? Like the idea that things have to be a certain way. The person who I was in conversation with this about is a woman who goes by the handle The People's Oracle on Twitter. And she's esoteric and a little bit woo-woo, but also like wicked smart on these questions of equity. And one of the things that she said was, think about the idea that your survival doesn't have to be dependent on your ability to trade your labor for money. We could build a society where your survival as a human being was valued enough that it was provided for whether you were able to work or not. And that was one example to me. And when I was sharing that with some of my own audience in the last couple of days, that blew people wide open, because we're so conditioned to the idea that we are living in a capitalist system where, here in the States particularly, our health insurance is tied to whether or not we're working in many instances. And so, again, I think we need to consider the ways in which we're almost unconsciously conditioned to thinking it has to be a certain way, and that inequity is baked into it. When in fact, part of the process of becoming a heroine in my book is about freeing your mind as well as your actions from the constraints that we've all been told are necessary and mandatory and permanent.
And I love what you were saying about like just reevaluating how things need to be done. One of the things that's happening here in Canada, and you are correct that we have so many incredible social structures that support women, but it is one of childcare costs, or one of the, the highest costs in the world in Canada. And they're just rolling out or working on a 5-year strategy to do $10 daycare, affordable daycare, government supported daycare. And that there's an example, a model in Quebec where they've had $10 or $8.50 daycare for many years, and it shows in the representation of women in the workforce. So there are examples of all of these things working throughout the world, and it has taken, in some cases, a global pandemic to really push things forward. Yep. So I love that, and I think that just further contributes to the impeccable timing of the release of your book. So I have a question for you. You have your foreword is written by Latosha Brown, and she speaks about how your leadership has transformed and is centered on uplifting Brown, Black, and Indigenous women, while also mobilizing all the women, how all women can create change. So I'd love to have you share a few ways that white women of privilege can come to become more allies, or to become allies of women of color. You have been a huge ally for women of color and lending your voice. So I know there will be a lot of women in the WNORTH community that want to support these movements of change.
So I tell a story in the book about the way in which my company went through a major transformation a couple of years ago on this front. And in particular about my own decision to stop taking diversity and inclusion work that is directed toward people of color and instead referring it to my colleagues who are people of color. And that is something that, you know, I've had white women in the field say to me, well, but you're giving away business. And my response to that has been, you know, for those of us who live, this is a very famous quote, but for those of us who live in spaces of privilege, equity feels like loss. And to me, I'm very fortunate in this way. While, you know, obviously along with everybody else, we lost a lot of business during the pandemic. You know, our company has had incredibly beneficial years in advance of this, where, you know, I'm not worried about my children not being able to eat, so to speak, right? And at the same time, to me, you have to walk your talk, right? You know, like I see a lot of white women, you know, for instance, if they're declining an opportunity or they're up for a job and they know that there's someone else, a woman of color, who is equally, if not more qualified, I'm always shocked by not actually putting that on the line, right? And I think we need a lot more of that. We need to say, I'm not a fit for this role, but here's this amazing person who you may not have heard of who is. And then the flip side of that is that I have certainly had instances in my professional life where I've had clients who have worked with me and with another Black consultant simultaneously, where I have literally said to the client, I want a guarantee from you that you are paying them the same as what you're paying me. And I have now made that part of my speaking platform as well, where if I am appearing with other Black keynotes on a panel or at a conference, I am asking the question before I commit as to whether or not the pay is equal. And again, I think these are things that we consciously have to be doing, in part because there are so many systems in place where those sorts of issues are not even considered. And frankly, you know, the other thing I will just say here is that I have reached a place in my development where I recognize that I am not the best voice to be speaking about equity for Black women in the workplace, for instance. That is not my experience, right? And so even though I bring a lot of assets to the table, I would much rather uplift women of color who are in positions where their lived experience can speak to these issues, and thereby also create greater equity in my field. And so I think that's part of it. I think it has to be more than, you know, we hear a lot of this like listen to Black women slogan out there. It's more than that. You actually have to be willing to put your own privilege on the line and be willing to undermine it, undermine your own privilege to benefit other people, right? That it's not going to come apart unless we're willing to do that work as white allies, and also willing to kind of do our own work progressively. Like my own trajectory on this has been a very steep learning curve over, you know, the last 5-10 years. And that work is ongoing because, you know, the one thing I just want to say about this is that, you know, peeling back your internalized racism and your experience of white supremacy as a white person is never ending. And, you know, I say this in the book, you know, the path of the heroine for all of us, whatever our lived experience, is one that once you're off it, you don't get to step off of. But I feel very, very strongly about that for white women in particular, that this is our obligation as beneficiaries of white privilege to constantly be questioning how we can show up better, how we can undermine our privilege, and how we can work to undermine white supremacy so that we create more equity in every step of what we do.
I love that. And one of the ways that we can continue to do that in our own lives, and one of the things that I will try to do is there's a big movement to say no right now. Oh, no, this, I can't speak at that. I can't do that. My answer to that is I actually am the movement of yes, but if I can't do it, if it's a speaking opportunity, if it's a board seat, if it's a something, I pay it forward. So it's like, I will give you, I'm not going to say no. I'm just going to say it's not me, it's somebody else. So that's, something I've been practicing in that level of elevating voices and directing, an opportunity to somebody who may not otherwise have that opportunity. One of the things, first of all, I just love what you were talking about with regards to your consulting work. And I think it sends an incredibly powerful message. Many of the DEI departments in corporate America are fundamentally flawed, and organizations have been working to rebuild since Black Lives Matter. So what are some of the ways you'd like to see diversity, equity, and inclusion departments and landscapes, or the way that some of the good examples that you've seen that are shifting in the last few months? What are some pieces of advice you could give to leaders in that space from your lived experience?
Yeah, so let me start with what I don't want to see, because I have some experiences with that too that are, that are distressing. So let me say that I do think there is a certain degree of corporate human resources, for lack of a better way of putting it, that views diversity and inclusion as a means to silence complaint, right? And rather than looking at the big systemic problems that may exist inside the institution, like why you've only got 14% of women in leadership, or why you only have one person of color on your board, instead we'll say, oh, here's some money for a DEI committee, and you can bring in a couple of speakers, and maybe that'll make you happy, right? It's been much more of a sort of Band-Aid to the larger problem of equity. And so one of the things that I have been really invested in over the last couple of years, and there's a researcher that I quote, and her name is now going to escape me, but who is at Stanford's VWare lab, where they do research on gender equity work. One of the things that their research has demonstrated is that if there are not men in senior leadership positions inside corporations that have an equity problem, who are committed to admitting that part of their own advancement comes from privilege, and they are willing to talk to other men, white men, about that fact, it's very hard to create systemic overhauls of institutions. So there has to be an allyship from people who are already in privilege, right? And then in addition to that, one of the things that I think is really key is that companies who are really committed to it have to be willing to consider the systems that have led to that in the first place inside their own institutions. So that may be like, where are you interviewing for your new hires? Are you interviewing at HBCUs? Are you interviewing at historically female universities, right? Or are you only going to a certain very limited niche of business schools that bred your current leadership, in which case you're going to get your current leadership all over again, right? What are you doing in the context of promotion? Are you considering how affirmative commitments to diverse talent can be made? Can priorities be built that way? I am not opposed to some of the things, for instance, that have happened at Salesforce, where they don't have a meeting that makes decisions about the future of that company that doesn't have at least a third of the people in the room diverse. I would like to see 50, but they're making progress. So I think it has to be really very much about action and understanding that if all you're doing is slapping a Band-Aid on the problem, you're actually going to end up worse, because you're going to end up with the same systemic problems that already exist. And then you're going to have frustrated, diverse talent that is going to recognize that you're not authentically living into the things that you're saying you want for the institution. So I think it's got to be, very broad. And I think it has to be about what you say and not just about what you do and not just what you say.
I agree 100%. And we've been doing the work at WNORTH in sort of the women's leadership pipeline. And I think, that this DEI strategy also, it needs to refocus on that pipeline, but it also even needs to go one step further into like, who's even in the pipeline, as you were talking about, like, where are you sourcing these employees? Where are you interviewing your new hires, et cetera, et cetera? Because, many organizations and corporate Canada are saying, well, we don't have, any Indigenous women to promote into leadership. Well, you may not even have any Indigenous women in your organization. Right. So that's the first problem that we need to fix. So I agree. I think if you don't have C-suite bought in 100% and is not in the top, 3 objectives of the company, then unfortunately, sometimes these DEI leaders are set up to fail because they're not getting the resources or the buy-in that they need to. So, on a little bit of a closing note, because we are coming to time, can you share a little bit about because this book just came out on Tuesday. So, how is this? And this is your first book, correct? So a little bit about that journey and launching a book online, and again, also where people can get your book.
Yeah, so the book is published by Penguin Random House on the Portfolio imprint. All the links you can buy everywhere. There is an Audible version that I narrated myself. There is an ebook version, and then of course there's the hard copy, which is actually I'm reversed. It's you have the cover right here. That's what it looks like. You can go to my personal website, not our business website, but my personal website, which is emclaughlin.com, has links for all of it. But this has been a really interesting experience because the book was originally supposed to come out last year, and then the pandemic hit. And my writing process got completely derailed because I'm a single mother of 2 kids. They're 9 and 7. They were inside doing virtual learning for 16 months. And so I had to really, as I think with most of us, reevaluate my priorities. And, everybody's working life obviously shifted dramatically over the last year and a half. I found myself getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to write. And I would get like 3 hours in before the kids woke up. And this book was really written in big bursts of time that I was able to carve out. But it's probably the most thought I've had to put into how to meet my own deadlines in really weird ways. I mean, I know a lot of us were in the same boat as caregivers, but that I've ever had to do in my life. And there are a lot of people who have remarked that it's sort of incredible that I managed to write a 288-page book in the middle of a pandemic. I agree. It was definitely a ride. But on the other hand, as you pointed out, the timing of this book has ended up being fantastic. And so I don't mind that it got bumped a year. I think, honestly, the messages of this book, particularly about how we maximize on opportunity when it's presented to us for real, wild, world-changing change, it really meets the moment.
I 100% agree. And I want to thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us on the stage once again at WNORTH. And for those of you that are part of the WNORTH fabric, we have a membership. We are hopping onto a Meet the Author with Elizabeth. If you have not heard about WNORTH, we are the only organization dedicated to the development of women mid-career on a trajectory towards senior executive leadership. We have a membership community with virtual learning and masterminds to connect women on their path to leadership positions. So I encourage you to check us out at wnorthconnect.com. And for Elizabeth and I, we will be hopping over to go meet some of our members. And thank you all for joining us on the various platforms. And we will see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you.